The Hall of Eternal Moon had never felt so much like a tomb. Beatrice Raymond stood at the edge of the ceremonial platform, her hands folded in front of her plain grey dress, her spine straight, even as her knees threatened to give. Hundreds filled the chamber tonight, nobles in fur-trimmed coats, warriors still armored from patrol, elders leaning on carved staffs, pack leaders who had traveled 3 days to be here. Twin braziers of sacred fire flanked the platform on either side, their light climbing the stone archway behind her and losing itself in the mist beyond, where the world outside the hall had gone soft and grey. 1,000 faces watched her from the shadows between the flames. She did not belong among them, and every one of them knew it. No jewels, no white ceremonial gown, no family crest stitched into her collar. Just a girl who had grown up scrubbing floors in the servants' wing, raised by an old healer named Cora, after her own mother died with no name worth remembering. The nobles didn't bother lowering their voices. Why is she even here? Just another orphan Omega. She doesn't belong. Let them whisper. She had survived 19 years on far less than their approval. Near the back of the crowd, half hidden behind broader shoulders, Cora watched her with knotted hands and worried eyes. She was the only person in the Hall of Eternal Moon who had come for Beatrice, and no one else. Beatrice held on to that the way she held on to everything now, quietly, and without letting it show on her face. Then her eyes found him, and the whispers stopped mattering. Alpha King Arthur Draven stood at the center of the dais, black cloak heavy across his shoulders, silver wolves embroidered along the hem, catching the firelight like they were running. He looked exactly like what he was, the man who had united 6 of the 7 northern packs through sheer will, who had never once lost a challenge, who commanded 10,000 wolves without raising his voice. He did not look at her. Not yet. For nearly a year, that had never been true. For nearly a year, this man had found her in the moonlit garden behind the east wall, had pressed his mouth to her hair, and called her mine, where no one else could hear. They had traded promises beside the sacred lake, low-voiced and half-laughing, as though the water might carry their secret away if they spoke too loudly. He had sunk his teeth into her wrist beneath a full moon, and claimed her the old way, the true way, long before any ceremony could make it official. The council demands I hear every noble family's proposal, he had told her 3 weeks ago, his forehead against hers, but when the ceremony ends, I will choose only you. She had believed him with her whole chest. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button, and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. Beneath her sleeve, hidden against her skin, hung the only proof she had, his mother's moon pendant, given to her in secret the night he'd first called her his mate. She pressed 2 fingers to it now, through the fabric, the way she had every night since. The high priestess struck her silver staff against the marble. The Alpha King will now choose his destined Luna. 5 noble daughters climbed the platform in white. At their center stood Lady Selene Raverin, daughter of the wealthiest house in the realm, beautiful in the deliberate way of someone who had practiced it. Her smile was polished and perfectly empty, and it never once reached her eyes. Beatrice barely saw her. She was watching Arthur, waiting for the look, the nod, anything. He would not meet her eyes. His shoulders had gone rigid, his breathing shallow in a way she had never seen from him. Not in battle, not in council, never. The bond between them, always warm as banked coals, had gone strangely, terribly cold. For the first time since the night he'd claimed her, she could not feel him at all. Alpha Arthur Draven, the high priestess said, before your people, whom do you choose? The hall went still. Arthur stepped forward, his lips parted, and for one impossible heartbeat, his eyes finally found hers. And what she saw there was not doubt. It was terror, raw and helpless, like something inside him was screaming, and could not get out. Then his face closed like a door. I choose Lady Selene Raverin. The hall exploded into cheering. Somewhere, alliances were being toasted. Somewhere, the future of a kingdom had just been decided. Beatrice was the only one who heard the sound of her own heart breaking. Beneath her sleeve, the claiming mark ignited. A pain so total, it felt like a hand reaching into her chest and tearing. Every instinct told her to scream, to beg, to fall to her knees in front of 1,000 witnesses and demand to know why. Instead, something colder and steadier rose up in her. She lifted her chin, straightened her spine, and walked onto the platform. The cheering died into confusion as the forgotten Omega crossed toward the Alpha King. Arthur's face drained of color. "Beatrice." She didn't stop for him. "I am not here to beg," she said, her voice carrying farther than she expected. "You have made your choice." She touched the mark burning beneath her sleeve, then let her hand fall. "So hear mine. I reject you too, Alpha." Gasps rippled outward from the platform. The silence that followed had a texture to it. No one in that hall, no elder, no warrior, no ancient bloodline, had ever heard those words spoken by a rejected mate. Rejection ran one direction only. It always had. "You may keep your throne," she said. "Your alliances, the future you chose tonight, but you no longer get mine. Please." Arthur's voice cracked as he stepped toward her. "Don't leave." Tears rose, hot and unwelcome, because part of her still loved him. That was the cruelest part. But love without trust was only a prettier kind of cage. "I was ready to spend forever beside you," she said quietly. "You weren't." Then she turned and walked through the great doors into the moonlight and did not look back once. Behind her, Alpha King Arthur Draven dropped to one knee, as if the floor itself had given out beneath him. His wolf tore loose a sound no one in that hall had ever heard him make. Not pain exactly, but grief, ancient and enormous. Nobles who had been cheering a heartbeat earlier now backed away, uneasy, unsure what they were watching. Lady Celine's victorious smile faltered at the edges. The claiming mark over his heart did not fade the way a broken bond should. It only grew louder. Something was very wrong with the Alpha King, and no one standing in the Hall of Eternal Moon understood it yet. Somewhere beyond those walls, the hands that had poisoned this night into being were already counting it as a victory, unaware that the Omega walking into the dark had just changed the shape of everything that came next. Beatrice was 3 miles from the Hall of Eternal Moon before the screaming in the bond finally began to fade. She hadn't stopped moving since the doors closed behind her. The forest swallowed the firelight and the cheering both, until there was only cold air in her lungs and mud soaking through her slippers and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She didn't stop now. Every step put more distance between herself and a man who was, at this very moment, probably still on his knees on that marble floor. And every step made it easier to believe she hadn't imagined the terror in his eyes before he said Celine's name instead of hers. She didn't go back to her room in the servants' wing. There was nothing there worth the risk of being seen. A few dresses, a chipped wash basin, nothing that had ever truly belonged to her anyway. She left without a word to anyone, not even Cora. Later, guilt would find her for that. Tonight, there was no room for it. By the time the sky began to grey at the edges, she had crossed out of Dravenland entirely, and she had a new name ready on her tongue in case anyone asked. Beatrice Raymond, Orphan Omega, had walked into the Hall of Eternal Moon. Someone else walked out of the forest on the other side. She called herself Wren. Wren traveled 11 days before the roads ran out and only footpaths remained, climbing higher into country so remote, most maps simply left it blank. She found Hollowmere by accident, a scatter of stone cottages tucked into a fold of the mountains, small enough that no noble had bothered claiming it in 100 years. The villagers asked no questions she didn't want to answer. They only cared that her hands, when she pressed them to a fevered child's forehead, seemed to know exactly what to do. An old shepherd named Tobin was the first to trust her, after she set his broken leg without so much as flinching at the sound. He started leaving eggs on her doorstep before dawn, never knocking, never asking for thanks. It was such a small thing. She cried over it anyway, alone, the first night she let herself. The herbcraft had come from Cora, who always said it had come from Beatrice's grandmother before her, a healer whose name had been lost even to Cora, though not her knowledge. Wren ground willow bark and hung yarrow from the rafters and delivered breech babies by candlelight, and slowly the villagers stopped treating her like a stranger and started treating her like someone they couldn't imagine doing without. Weeks passed. She stopped flinching at the word Alpha. Then months passed, And one grey morning, kneeling sick over a basin for the third day running, she finally understood why her body had felt so unfamiliar to her. Twins. 2 heartbeats, when the midwife who examined her pressed a careful ear to her stomach and went very quiet before smiling. She sat very still for a long time afterward, one hand pressed to her stomach, the other closed around the moon pendant she had never once made herself remove. Part of her wanted to weep for the family this should have been, a nursery in the palace, a father who paced the hallway outside during the birth, not this cold cottage, and a name that wasn't even hers. She let herself feel it for exactly one evening. Then she told no one, not yet. Some truths she had learned were safer kept small. 200 miles south, Alpha King Arthur Draven woke gasping on the floor of his own chamber, and for the first time in weeks, his mind belonged entirely to him. The fog that had smothered his thoughts lifted all at once, and every memory came back with it, sharp enough to cut. The garden, the lake, his teeth at her wrist, his own voice, hollow and wrong, saying a name that wasn't hers in front of 1,000 witnesses. He had chosen Celine. He remembered it now like watching a stranger wear his face. He was on his feet and out the door before he finished understanding what had been done to him. He tore apart the servant's wing. He sent riders to every village within 3 days' ride. He offered a reward, large enough to ruin lesser houses, to anyone who could bring him word of an Omega traveling alone. He found nothing. She had simply stopped existing. He refused to complete the bonding with Celine. She came to him in the map room, dressed for a wedding that kept not happening, and asked him coldly how long he intended to humiliate her in front of the entire kingdom. "Until I understand what was done to me that night," he said. "You were there. Tell me you didn't notice anything wrong with me either." Celine's expression didn't so much as flicker. "I noticed you chose me," she said, and left. The council pressed. Lord Raverin pressed harder. Arthur ignored all of it, spending his nights pacing the garden where he had once found her waiting, until the pack elders began exchanging glances they thought he couldn't see. The kingdom found its own explanation, and it traveled faster than any of his riders. The Alpha King has gone mad. In a windowless chamber, deep beneath House Raverin's estate, a cloaked figure knelt before Lord Raverin's desk and delivered the only report that mattered. "She's alive, my lord," a healer matching her description. 3 weeks north, in the mountains near Hollowmere. Lord Raverin didn't look up from the letter he was sealing. "The Omega survived," he said softly, almost admiring. Then he set down his pen. "Find her before the king's men do. And this time, make certain she doesn't survive twice." 4 months slipped by in Hollowmere before the rest of the world finally found her. By then, Wren's condition was no longer a secret she could keep hidden under loose wool dresses. The villagers had guessed weeks ago and said nothing, in the quiet, generous way of people who had decided a person's past was their own business. Tobin still left eggs on her doorstep, though now he left double. Children waved when she passed. She had grown almost comfortable there, almost. Then 2 traders came through with a wagon of salt and dried fish, and stayed the night at the tavern, and talked. She caught it while stripping willow bark on the bench outside, and her hands went still. The Alpha King, gone soft in the head if you ask me, won't finish the bonding. 4 months now and Lady Celine still isn't Luna, in anything but name. They say he doesn't sleep anymore. Rides out himself some nights, searching. Offered a year's tax relief to any village that turns up an Omega, matching some description he won't explain. Heard he tore apart a merchant's cart with his bare hands last month. Over nothing. Man's coming undone. Poor woman, whoever she is. Man like that decides he wants you found. You get found eventually. Wren made herself start stripping bark again before anyone noticed her hands shaking. He found her 3 days later, at dusk, standing outside her cottage door, as though he'd been there an hour, deciding whether to knock. She recognized him instantly despite the road dust and the plain, unmarked clothes. Garrick, Arthur's first beta, who had stood at his shoulder through 6 years of war councils, and had once, quietly, been kind to her when no one else in the palace bothered. The last time she'd seen his face, he'd been standing near the dais, watching the ceremony unfold like a man watching a building he loved catch fire. Her hand went to the door, ready to shut it. 5 minutes, he said. Then I'll leave. Tell him I found nothing, and you'll never see me again. I swear it on my rank. Something in his voice, exhausted, threadbare, nothing like the composed soldier she remembered, made her step back instead. She let him in, and he stood near the door rather than sitting, like a man who didn't trust himself to stay if he got comfortable. Up close, she could see what 4 months of searching had cost him. Hollows under his eyes, a tremor he kept trying to still in one hand. He didn't waste the 5 minutes. The wine, he said. At the ceremony, it was poisoned. Moonbane essence. Most betas have only read about it, never smelled it. It doesn't kill. It's worse than killing. It suppresses the instincts, chains the wolf down so deep a man can't feel it anymore. It blocks the mate bond entirely, and it forces obedience, not to just anyone, to whoever administered the dose, or to whatever they command you to say while it's still in your blood. Ren's stomach turned to ice. That's convenient, she said, before she could stop herself. A poison no one can prove, arriving 4 months after he already broke my heart in front of 1,000 witnesses. I know how it sounds. Garrick didn't flinch from it. I'd have said the same if I hadn't watched him afterward. A man doesn't collapse like that over a bond he meant to break. I've seen him fight through wounds that should have killed him without so much as a grimace. That night he screamed. He didn't waste the rest of the 5 minutes. He didn't choose her, Garrick said. He was made to. I've spent 4 months proving it, because I watched a man who loved you stand on that platform and say another woman's name like it was being dragged out of him with hooks. House Raverin arranged the wine. House Raverin arranged all of it. The seating, the timing, even which guards stood duty that night. Lord Raverin wanted his daughter on that throne, and he didn't care what it cost the Alpha King to put her there. Ren opened her mouth, to argue, to disbelieve, to ask any of the 100 questions crowding her throat. But no sound came out, because behind Garrick, the door splintered inward off its hinges. 3 cloaked figures came through the wreckage before either of them could move, blades already drawn, moving with the flat, wordless efficiency of people paid to make a problem disappear. Down! Garrick threw himself sideways, dragging Ren behind the hearth, as the first blade buried itself in the doorframe where her head had been a heartbeat earlier. He came up with a knife from his boot, putting his body between her and the door before she had even finished falling. Whoever sent you, he said, low and even, made a mistake. The nearest assassin didn't answer. He simply came on, and the small, warm cottage that had been the only safe place Ren had known in 4 months filled with the sound of steel. She pressed both hands over the curve of her stomach, over the 2 lives she had promised herself no one would ever get close enough to touch, and understood with sudden, brutal clarity that hearing the truth and surviving it were not going to be the same thing tonight. The first assassin lunged for Garrick, and steel met steel with a shriek that filled the cottage. Garrick was good. 6 years at Arthur's shoulder had made him good, but he was 1 beta against 3 trained killers, and Ren watched him take a shallow line across the ribs that should have dropped a lesser man. It didn't drop him, it slowed him. That was almost worse. She would not just crouch behind the hearth and wait to find out which one she'd become, the dead Omega or the captured one. Ren snatched the iron poker from beside the grate and swung it 2-handed into the knee of the second assassin as he came around the hearth for her, felt the satisfying crack of it connecting, heard him drop with a curse. It bought her nothing. A third was already past him, blade rising toward the curve of her stomach with the flat, businesslike aim of a man who had been told exactly where to strike. She threw herself backward into the corner, one arm curling instinctively over her middle, and there was nowhere left to go. Stone at her back, a blade in front of her, and nothing in her hands but a healer's instincts that had never once been trained for this. Garrick shouted her name, too far away, blood soaking through his shirt, where the first blade had found him again. The assassin's arm came down, and something inside Ren answered. It didn't feel like fire. It felt like moonlight given weight. Silver light tearing out of her chest and her hands, and the crown of her skull, all at once, flooding the small cottage, until the walls themselves seemed to glow from within. It didn't feel new. It felt like something that had been sleeping in her blood for generations, and had simply been waiting for a reason cruel enough to wake it. The assassin above her screamed, a wrong sound, wolf and man both, as the light touched him, not burning his skin so much as scouring something out from underneath it. Black smoke curled off him, like rot lifting from a wound. He staggered back, clawing at his own arms, and the other two were already retreating from the doorway, faces twisted in something closer to horror than pain. Corrupted. Garrick gasped from the floor, staring at her like he was seeing a stranger. They're corrupted. Someone's poisoned their wolves too. And your light, it's purifying them, burning it out. The three assassins didn't stay to test how much more of it they could survive. They fled into the trees, one of them still smoking faintly at the edges, and the silver light guttered out of Wren all at once, leaving her shaking and hollow, and very suddenly aware of how tired she was. That was when the howl came. It rolled down off the peaks above Hollowmere, and through the whole valley at once, a sound with claws in it, and every dog in the village answered, before falling silent, out of pure instinct. Wren knew that howl. She had heard a gentler version of it once, whispered against her hair, in a moonlit garden, a lifetime ago. He came through what was left of the doorway still mid-shift, fur receding from skin, and for one suspended second, Arthur Draven simply stood there and looked at her like a man who had spent 4 months convinced he was chasing a ghost. Beatrice, not Wren. He said it like a prayer he'd forgotten he still remembered how to say. His eyes found Garrick next, slumped and bleeding against the hearth, and something fierce and grateful crossed his face. You found her, he said. You're bleeding out on her floor, and you found her. Garrick managed a thin, exhausted smile, and waved him off toward the far more urgent problem still standing across the room. The bond between them didn't trickle back to life. It slammed open, both directions at once, warmth and grief, and 4 months of separation crashing through her in a single unbearable wave. And for one traitorous heartbeat, her body swayed toward him before her mind caught up. He crossed the room in 3 strides and reached for her, and she stepped back. His hands stopped in the air between them. Empty. Beatrice. Don't. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the only thing that let her keep talking. You don't get to walk through that door and expect my arms to just remember how to open for you. I know what I did to you. I know I don't deserve. This isn't about what you deserve. She glanced at Garrick, still bleeding on her floor, at the scorch marks on her own walls, at the life growing inside her, that 3 strangers had just tried to end over a war she hadn't chosen to be part of. It's about what I can survive believing in again. Arthur lowered his hands slowly, and for the first time she saw the same helpless terror in his eyes that she'd seen across that ceremonial platform 4 months and a lifetime ago. Then let me earn it back, he said. Whatever it takes, however long. Wren, Beatrice, wrapped both arms around herself, instead of around him, and held his gaze without flinching. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. They didn't speak again until well past midnight, after Garrick had been stitched and settled by the village's own healer, an elderly woman who eyed the Alpha King with far more suspicion than awe, and the cottage had been swept clear of shattered wood and dried blood, as best as 2 exhausted people could manage. Beatrice sat on one side of the hearth. Arthur sat on the other, close enough to reach her, and far enough that he wouldn't try. Start from the wine, she said. All of it. Don't leave anything out to spare either of us. So he did. He told her about the cup the High Priestess herself had pressed into his hands before the ceremony. Blessed wine from a blessed vessel. Nothing that should have been questioned. He told her how his thoughts had gone thick and slow within the hour, how his wolf, always a constant, familiar presence at the edge of his mind, had gone silent, then simply gone. He told her how he had stood on that platform hearing his own voice, choose a stranger's name, and had been unable to do anything but watch himself do it, trapped somewhere behind his own eyes, screaming with no mouth to scream from. I don't remember agreeing to any of it, he said. I remember wanting to die rather than say it. And then I said it anyway. He told her about the months after, riding until his horses gave out beneath him, sleeping in his armor, because he couldn't stand the stillness of a bed built for 2, standing in doorways of strangers' homes, describing her hands, her laugh, the exact color of her eyes, to people who looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. He hadn't cared, as long as losing it meant he never stopped looking. 4 months, Beatrice said quietly. You've had 4 months to search. I've had 4 months to become someone else. Then tell me who she is. So she did. She told him what it had cost her to stand in that hall in a servant's dress, while 5 noble daughters wore white. She told him about the year of hidden meetings that had made her believe, foolishly, that an orphan Omega could be loved out loud, and not just in secret. She told him about the silence in the bond that night, the specific singular loneliness of grieving a man who was still breathing 40 feet away from her. She told him what it did to a person to walk 11 days through unfamiliar forest, with nothing but a new name and a habit of flinching at every sound behind her. I built a life with none of you in it, she said, and it was smaller and harder, and it was mine, and some nights that was the only thing keeping me upright. Neither of them tried to argue the other out of what they'd felt. There was nothing to argue. It had all been true. It was in the quiet after that Arthur finally really looked at her. Not at her face, but at the shape of her beneath the blanket she'd pulled around herself against the cold, and went very still. Beatrice. His voice had changed entirely. Are you? Yes. His breath left him like he'd been struck. How far along? 4 months. Since the ceremony. She made herself hold his gaze. There's something else. The village midwife heard 2 heartbeats. Arthur Draven, Alpha King of the 7 Northern Packs, who had not wept in front of another living soul since he was 12 years old, put his face in his hands and wept. I have children, he said, muffled, disbelieving. I have a family I didn't even know to fight for, and I almost lost all 3 of you tonight. To men, I never sent anyone to stop. You didn't send them, Arthur. You didn't choose any of this. I still get to choose what happens next. He lifted his head, eyes red, and for once didn't reach for her. I'll spend the rest of my life earning your forgiveness. Not asking for it, earning it. However long it takes, however far away you need me to stand while I do it. It wasn't an apology that fixed anything. It didn't put the year back, or the 4 months, or the ache that still lived under her ribs when she looked at him too long. But it was honest. And lately, honesty had become the only currency Beatrice still trusted. Start with staying alive, she said. We can talk about the rest after. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. He didn't reach for her hand. He only set his own, palm up, on the stone floor between them, and left it there, an offer with no expectation attached to it. After a long moment, Beatrice looked at it, and did not take it, and did not move hers away either. It was the smallest possible truce. It was still more than either of them had allowed in 4 months, and it didn't last. Hoofbeats hit the village road outside, too many and too fast, and Garrick was on his feet, with a hand pressed to his bandaged ribs, before the first scout even reached the door. My king. The scout's face was grey with more than the ride. The capital's fallen. House Raverin seized the palace 3 days ago. The council's imprisoned. The banners are already changed, and... He hesitated, glancing once at Beatrice before forcing the rest out. They're holding hostages, my lord. Servants from the old wing. Word is, they mean to execute them within the week. Beatrice felt the blood leave her face. Cora, she whispered. They rode for 3 days without stopping longer than it took to change horses, and every mile closer to the capital, the villages they passed grew quieter, wearier, watchful in a way Beatrice didn't like. In one town, a woman selling bread wouldn't meet Arthur's eyes even after recognizing him, and glanced twice toward the road before whispering that soldiers had passed through asking who still spoke of the old king with any fondness. She wouldn't say more than that. She didn't need to. They found the war camp on the 4th morning. Loyalist wolves who had refused to kneel to House Raverin, gathered in the hills 2 miles outside the capital's walls, waiting for a king they'd been told to stop hoping for. When Arthur rode into camp still half wild from 4 days without proper sleep, the cheer that went up nearly shook the mountain loose. From the ridge above the tents, the city spread out below them, and Beatrice understood, all at once, exactly how much had changed. The silver wolf banners that had flown over the palace her entire life were gone. In their place hung black cloth marked with a blood-red raven, House Raverin's sigil, raised over walls it had never once had the right to claim. 3 nobles who spoke against the coup are dead, said the beater, who'd been holding the loyalists together, a grim older wolf named Osric. Publicly, so no one else gets ideas. The full council's imprisoned beneath the palace, and 4 days ago, Lady Selene stood on the same balcony her father used for speeches, and named herself queen. She has no bond, Arthur said flatly. No claiming. She can call herself whatever she wants. It changes nothing. It changes what the soldiers holding swords to prisoners' throats believe, Osric said. Lord Raverin's not interested in legitimacy. He's interested in fear. Public executions started 2 days ago. Petty theft, questioning the new banners, doesn't take much. He hesitated, then looked at Beatrice directly. There's a list for tomorrow. Servants from the old wing, mostly. There's a healer on it. Older woman, Cora. Beatrice's knees nearly went out from under her. Garrick's hand found her elbow before Arthur's could. Then we attack tonight, Arthur said, already turning toward the war tent. Every wolf in this camp, every gate at once. We overwhelm them before they can touch a single hostage. And the moment your army moves, Beatrice said, Raverin kills every hostage he's holding before your first wolf reaches the wall. You'd be racing your own army to save people. Your army is what gets them killed. I am not standing outside these walls doing nothing while Cora. I'm not asking you to do nothing. I'm asking you not to do the thing that gets her throat cut in the first 10 minutes. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it, and she didn't take it back. You have a soldier's answer for everything, Arthur. This needs something else. Then give me a better one. He turned on her, and beneath the anger, she recognized the same terror she'd seen twice now, on the ceremonial platform and in her cottage doorway. Because the only plan I can think of that doesn't involve an army also doesn't involve you anywhere near that city. And I already know you're not going to accept that answer. No, she agreed. I'm not. You're 4 months pregnant with my children, and you nearly died 2 nights ago. And I am also the only person in this camp who grew up inside that palace, who knows which servants' passages don't appear on any map you own, and who Cora would recognize instantly even through a locked door. She held his gaze unflinching. You can order your army. You cannot order me. He didn't have a response to that. Neither of them did, not yet. And that was the problem. There was no clever answer sitting ready in either of their mouths, only a clock running down toward tomorrow, and a war council that would spend all night arguing strategy, while a woman who had raised Beatrice out of nothing waited in a cell to die for it. Beatrice said nothing further. She let Arthur believe the conversation was merely unfinished, that she would still be there in the morning to keep arguing her side of it. It was the first lie she'd told him since the reunion, and it sat badly in her chest, even as she told herself it was necessary. He would never let her walk toward that palace willingly, and every hour spent convincing him was an hour Cora didn't have. Long after the camp had gone quiet, she wrapped herself in a dark cloak that wasn't hers, pressed one hand briefly to the moon pendant beneath her collar, for whatever courage it still held, and left the tent without waking Garrick where he slept across the entrance. She did not look back at the tent where Arthur lay finally, exhaustedly asleep, for fear that looking would be enough to stop her. Then she walked alone down the ridge, toward the black and red banners waiting below. By the time the sky began to lighten, Beatrice had stopped rehearsing what she would say and started simply walking, because thinking too hard about it would have sent her straight back up the ridge to Arthur's tent. He would wake soon and find her gone, and there was nothing she could do about the fury and terror that would follow. There was only what she could do about Cora. The palace gates were closer than Beatrice remembered them being, the last time she'd walked out through a servant's door with nothing but the clothes on her back. This time she walked toward the front gate itself, cloak thrown back from her face, and let the guards see exactly who was asking to be let in. Tell Lord Raverin, she said, that the Omega he's been hunting for 4 months is standing at his gate, and she's tired of running. She was inside the throne room within the hour, and it was worse than she'd imagined. The silver wolf tapestries stripped from the walls, draven silver replaced everywhere with raven black, Selene seated on a throne that had never once been offered to her by right. Lord Raverin stood beside it, composed, patient, watching Beatrice the way a man watches a debt finally coming due. "You could have simply stayed hidden," he said. "Braver than sensible, coming here yourself." "I'm not here to be brave. I'm here to bargain." Beatrice kept her voice level, though her heart was slamming hard enough to hurt. "You have hostages. Release every one of them, unharmed, tonight, in front of witnesses who can carry word to the camp outside your walls. Do that, and I won't fight whatever you intend to do with me." Celine's mouth curved, delighted. "Just like that. No pleading for the king to save you. He doesn't know I'm here." That was rather the point. Lord Raverin studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Bring the hostages up, all of them." Beatrice watched from across the throne room as they filed through. Servants, an old stable boy, and finally Cora, grey-faced but unbowed, who caught Beatrice's eyes for one aching second. "Foolish girl," Cora mouthed, not unkindly, before a guard hurried her toward the doors and out of the palace into the free night air. Beatrice let herself breathe once the doors closed behind them. Only once. "Now," Lord Raverin said, and something in his tone changed entirely. "The trap." Guards seized her arms before she could react. Celine rose from the throne, unhurried, drawing a ceremonial blade from her belt with the pleased composure of a woman who had waited months for exactly this moment. "You humiliated me in front of the entire kingdom," Celine said. "Do you know what it cost me, standing on that platform while an orphan servant rejected a king I'd already won? I didn't take anything from you that was ever really yours. You will now." Celine lifted the blade. "Wait." Lord Raverin's voice cracked through the room like a whip, and even his daughter froze. "Not her heart. Not yet. We need the blood, Celine, not a corpse that's already gone cold." He turned to Beatrice, and for the first time she saw something like reverence in his expression. "Your grandmother's line goes back further than anyone bothered telling you, Omega. Moon Queen blood. The same blood the first pact between Crown and Pack was sealed with, 5 centuries ago. Spilled the right way, in the right place, it can unmake that pact entirely. No claiming, no bloodline law, nothing standing between my daughter and a throne that answers to no one." "That's not possible," Beatrice said, even as some old, quiet part of her recognized the shape of the truth in it, the healer's instincts that had never needed teaching, the way pain and fear had always seemed to sharpen something in her blood, rather than break it. "My grandmother was a village healer, nothing more. Your grandmother spent 40 years hiding what she was so House Raverin could never find her line, and finish what our ancestors started 5 centuries ago." His eyes gleamed. "You were never hunted to be killed quickly, girl. You were hunted to be harvested carefully." Horror closed around Beatrice's throat. She thought of 2 heartbeats, of Arthur's hand open on the floor between them, of everything she still hadn't gotten to say. Celine didn't wait for her father to finish savoring it. The blade came down, and deep inside Beatrice, where 2 small lives had been growing in the dark for 4 months, something ancient and furious finally woke up. Silver light didn't just erupt from her this time, it consumed her, bone and blood and shape rewriting themselves in a single violent heartbeat, and where a pregnant, exhausted Omega had stood chained between 2 guards, a wolf rose instead. Not grey, not brown. A wolf built entirely of moonlight, silver from claw to crown, larger than any natural wolf had a right to be, with eyes that held centuries instead of years. The guards let go. They didn't have a choice. Their hands simply weren't there to hold with anymore. Celine's blade never landed. The throne room detonated in white-silver fire, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, every wolf in the loyalist camp lifted their heads at once toward a light bright enough to turn midnight into noon. Arthur heard the light before he saw it. Osric's voice cutting through his sleep, with 2 words that emptied his lungs. "She's gone." He didn't wait for a full report. He was already shifting, fur tearing through skin, and the war camp exploded into motion behind him as 300 loyalist wolves followed their king down the ridge, toward a palace, lit up like a second moon. They didn't need to break the gates. The gates were already open, guards fleeing past them in the opposite direction, faces white with terror at something they'd seen inside and had no intention of explaining. Arthur found the throne room in ruins, and Beatrice at the center of it. Not Beatrice exactly, not anymore, but a wolf built of moonlight, standing over Celine's fallen guard, with eyes that found his, and, impossibly, still recognized him. He didn't hesitate. He shifted at a dead run and fought at her side without a single word needed between them. Silver light and black fur moving together against Raverin's remaining soldiers, like they'd trained for this their entire lives instead of 4 days. Where his jaws cleared a path, her light closed it behind them, scouring the corrupted wolves from the ranks one by one, until only men who'd never been poisoned to begin with were left standing, and those simply threw down their swords. Garrick fought 2 steps behind them the entire time, still favoring his bandaged ribs, refusing every order to fall back. Lord Raverin tried to run only once, scrambling for the ritual blade Celine had dropped, screaming something about the pact, the blood, 5 centuries of patience unraveling in front of him. "You don't understand what you are," he shouted at her, more fury than fear in it, even at the end. "You were never meant to choose anything. You were meant to be spent." He never reached the blade. The last of Beatrice's power caught him mid-stride, and unmade him exactly the way it had unmade the corrupted wolves in her cottage. Not violence, precisely, but a purification too total for anything false to survive it. There was no body left to bury. There was barely light left to remember him by. Celine didn't run. She stood frozen at the foot of her stolen throne, as the silver light swept over her, and when it passed, something in her had gone with it. The wolf beneath her skin, the constant low hum of it, every shifter carried without noticing, until it was gone. She fell to her knees, clutching at her own chest, gasping at a silence that would never answer her again. By dawn, the freed council stood in the palace's broken doorway, before a crowd that had gathered from every corner of the capital, and told them everything. The poisoned wine, the stolen ceremony, 4 months of a king, hunted for a crime committed against him, rather than by him. They declared Arthur innocent before the sun had fully cleared the walls. Then the crowd saw her. Beatrice stood in the wreckage of the throne room, shifted back, swaying on her feet, blood at her temple, and both hands pressed instinctively to a stomach that had carried 2 lives through poison, exile, assassins, and a blade meant for her heart. She had walked into that palace alone, to save a woman nobody else would have crossed the street for, and given everything she had left to save a kingdom that had once called her nothing. Someone in the crowd knelt first, then another, then all of them, nobles and soldiers and servants together, until the entire courtyard had gone down on one knee before an orphan Omega in a torn grey dress. Among them, unrecognized in the crowd, stood a noblewoman who had once whispered, "She doesn't belong," across a ceremonial hall 4 months and a lifetime ago. She knelt lowest of all, and did not lift her eyes. Arthur knelt last of all, not with the crowd, but directly in front of her, taking both her hands in his, like something fragile he still couldn't quite believe he'd been given back. "I'm not kneeling as your king," he said, loud enough for the whole courtyard to hear, quiet enough that it still felt like it belonged only to her. "I'm kneeling as the man who loves you, asking for the only thing that still matters. Not your throne, not your forgiveness, not yet. I know that has to be earned, and I meant it when I said I'd spend my life doing it." He pressed his forehead to her hands. "Just tell me I can stay and try." The entire courtyard held its breath. 1,000 witnesses, silent, waiting on a single word from a woman who had once stood at the edge of a very different crowd, with nothing to her name but a grey dress and a broken heart. "Ask me properly," Beatrice finally said. "Not as a king, asking his kingdom to forgive him. Ask me as Arthur." The whole courtyard seemed to lean in with him. His throat worked before the words came. "Beatrice Raymond, will you let me spend the rest of my life proving I'm the man you fell in love with beside that lake, and not the one who stood on this platform and broke you?" She pulled him to his feet instead of answering in words, because after everything they'd survived, some promises needed a hand extended, more than a sentence spoken. "Yes," she said. "Not because you're a king, because you never stopped looking, even when looking cost you everything you thought you had left." When he claimed her fully that night, beneath a sky finally clear of moon poison and conspiracy both, the bond didn't simply return. It became something new, deeper, chosen twice now instead of once, forged as much by 4 months of survival as by the moon overhead. For the first time since the wine had been poured into a ceremonial cup, Beatrice felt him completely, with nothing false standing between them ever again. 3 weeks later, the Hall of Eternal Moon filled once more, not with mourners for a broken promise, but with witnesses to one finally kept. Silver wolf banners hung again from every arch, the same braziers burned, the same stone floor gleamed underfoot, but nothing else about the room resembled that first terrible night. Beatrice wore white this time, not because 5 noble houses had presented her as a candidate, but because she had chosen it herself, standing where those noble daughters once stood, at Arthur's side, rather than paraded before him. No one in that hall whispered that she didn't belong. No one dared. In the front row, where nobility had always stood before, Cora sat instead, weeping openly and making no attempt to hide it, with Garrick and Osric flanking her like honor guards. The orphan Omega, who had once scrubbed floors in the servants' wing, stood before her people as their queen, and the Hall of Eternal Moon had never held a silence so full of joy. 4 months after that, in a palace nursery that had waited 5 centuries for exactly this, Beatrice gave the kingdom its heirs. A son first, red-faced and already snarling at the cold air, who would grow into his father's broad shoulders and unshakable will. They named him Bran. A daughter after him, quiet and watchful, whose eyes, even hours old, caught the light with a faint, unmistakable silver. Beatrice held her a long moment before she spoke the name aloud, and Arthur understood exactly why she'd chosen it, the moment he heard it. "Wren," she said, "for the woman who kept us both alive long enough to get here." The healers who attended the birth swore, years later, that the boy's first cry had carried something of an alpha's command, even in the cradle, and that his sister's small hand, closing around her mother's finger, had left the faintest shimmer of moonlight behind before fading. The kingdom celebrated for a week. Bonfires burned in every village between the capital and the northern coast. Celine Raverin, stripped of title and wolf both, was exiled to the southern borderlands with what remained of her house's name. No longer a threat, no longer a queen, just a woman, learning to live without the things she'd been born believing, made her worth something. Beatrice found she couldn't hate her by then. There wasn't room left for it, not with 2 children learning to hold up their own heads. On the last night of it, Arthur found Beatrice alone on the balcony, where he'd once paced through months of searching, a sleeping twin cradled in each arm. "Do you still reject me?" he asked quietly. The old question turned gentle, more habit now than fear. Beatrice smiled, the same smile she'd worn the night she walked away from him and changed both their lives. "I rejected the man who abandoned me." She leaned up and kissed him, unhurried, certain. "But I chose the man who never stopped searching." Below them, beneath a full moon rising huge and silver over the 7 northern packs, wolves began to howl. One voice, then 100, then thousands, carrying from pack to pack, across mountains and valleys, until the whole kingdom seemed to sing with a single voice. The royal family stood together and listened, not to the sound of alliances secured or a throne defended, but to something older and simpler, a bond that had survived poison and exile and betrayal, forged in the end, not by ceremony or crown, but by a love that had chosen, again and again, to stay. Their kingdom's true story was only just beginning. Love these stories? Join the Ronan's Romance Tales membership to support the channel and unlock exclusive perks. Members get early access to new stories, special bonuses, and help keep these moonlit romances coming. Tap join and become part of the pack